Hello folks, and welcome back to Observations in Brass, being the recorded observations made by a hopeful author and aspiring inventor during the conception, design, construction, and it is sincerely hoped the eventual completion of a rolling ball sculpture, commonly and quite incorrectly referred to as a marble roller coaster, hereafter to be known upon its much anticipated eventual completion as the Perpetual Curiosity Engine No. 1, recorded by me, Liam Ball, the Gentleman Magician. This is observation number 3, the Helix. Welcome back folks to Observations in Brass. In the last video we took a look at a collection of brass box section, some rather elaborate gussets, a considerable quantity of solder and frankly more sanding than I had ever anticipated, and it turned into this. A beautiful frame, and with that finished we can finally move on to the part of this machine that will actually do something more than hold everything else together: the Helix Lift. Now its job is deceptively simple. A steel ball will arrive at the bottom of the machine and the Helix will collect it, and as it rotates carry it all the way to the top where gravity can take over and then all of the interesting nonsense can begin. Of course, saying that I'm just going to make a rotating brass helix is considerably easier than actually making one. It needs to be dead straight, it needs to be concentric, it needs to rotate freely, it needs to pick up a 20mm steel ball reliably, and perhaps, and most importantly, it needs to look as though it belongs on the machine that we've just spent all this time building. So I've got my axle, and I also visited Harlow Springs where they turn this piece of brass into my Helix Lift. All I need to do now is make a jig, drill this, spoke it, attach this to it. I've got a plan, but honestly, how easy is this going to be? Well, we need to get to the end of the video to see exactly how this is going to look and mount onto the machine. So let's go make a helix. Alright, so once I've got my axle drilled and I've already got my spiral spring made, the axle needs to get soldered into the center of the spring, perfectly in the middle, so that when it's turning it's not going to start wobbling from side to side, because the balls are going to be traveling up a wire. So in order to make sure that when I'm soldering all of the supporting arms from the axle that are going to go onto the spring here, I need some kind of jig or form in order to do that. Now, fabulously, I was watching Copper Gravity, another channel on YouTube, makes lots of fabulous marble runs and many other things as well. In one of his videos, when he was making one of these, somebody made a great suggestion to him that I'm going to follow. Essentially, I'm going to build a box which is exactly the size of the outside helix spiral, and at either end of the box there's going to be a hole which I can poke my rod into. What I can then do is I can solder down, knowing that this will be sat in the box, that the rod is exactly in the center forming the axle, and that when it comes out it should, in theory, be perfectly straight. So I'm here in the wood shop in order to make that happen. So how am I going to do it? Nice and simple. I've got this fabulous piece of MDF from B&Q. Actually, it was an offcut from the offcut bin. So when you're only needing a little bit like this, it was there, it was easy, and it didn't cost anything, just a small donation to charity, which is absolutely fantastic. I've got plenty of material here in order to make the box that I need to make so that it will be substantial. Now, this is ultimately going to be disposable, because once it's made, I'm going to break the ends off in order to get the Helix Lift out, and then that'll be it, it'll go in the bin. But again, it's another great use and a great example of making a very straightforward, simple jig that's going to do a job that is a single use only, but this is going to be perfect. So I'm actually going to start here on the table saw. This is the MDF. I need to cut a length which is 564mm long, then I can make my 3 sides out of that piece then a couple of pieces for the end, which I'll probably do on the chop saw there just behind me, before finally centre drilling the two end pieces with a hole that is wide enough and stable enough to hold the axle exactly central to the rest of the helix.
Hey there, what you drinking? 2 shots, let's pour it out. I know what you're thinking, but tomorrow won't come for us.
The first part of this helix starts here with my axle rod. This is an 8mm round brass bar that is 600mm long from start to finish, which is pretty much the exact height of the machine I've built so far. Now, this is going to sit on a bearing, top and bottom, which I already have, and it's going to rotate. So the first job is to mill the ends of this down to a 6mm shoulder, which will then sit inside the bearing. But once I've done that, I then need to drill holes at the right interval down my central axle shaft for the spokes to go in, so that once I get ready to attach it, it will sit perfectly in the centre of my helix spiral. Now, I've done some maths, and the spiral goes from top to bottom. There's going to be, I think, about 22, 23, 24 turns, somewhere about there. And what I've realised is that I need to drill enough holes on this to keep it stable. I decided that I was going to drill one spoke every 1 1/4 turns of the helix, and that it was going to go down so that I had just enough gap to make sure that all of the balls would lift up beautifully. In addition to that, I realised that because the helix runs clockwise, that the spokes in this need to run anti-clockwise, which seems really counterintuitive, but I really scratched my head. I did the drawings, I did the maths, and I promise it's absolutely right. And of course, I need to get them at the right interval. So essentially what I'm going to do is put 2mm spokes in this coming out, which will sit just under the helix. So once this is in the box jig, I can poke them in, solder them as I'm turning it, and solder them all the way down to get a nice solid helix. And the distance gap in order to do that is 33.3mm per centre, per hole, per spoke, with a 120-degree turn, which is exactly 1/3 of the axle. Yeah, easy, right? So what I'm actually doing here is just reducing the circumference of the ends of the bar from the 8mm that they are down to the 6mm, and also just tidying up the edges and the shoulders so that when I've done this, the bearing will fit perfectly. I started by facing the end of each bar so it's perfectly flat, and then adding the 6mm circumference at the shoulders. And it's all done, of course, on the lathe. One of the great things about the Hackspace is that it's free to use for everybody. And as you probably saw in that video, there were some sparks in the background. There's somebody actually in the metal shop who's doing some work on the hack eraser, lots of grinding and welding, and actually it's a really interesting thing to see. But while they were doing that, I was able to get my axle turned on the lathe. And there's a few different things that I've done here on the ends so that I can make it into the axle it's going to be. The first one is this. This is actually the bottom. It's going to sit that way. And I've milled a 6mm shaft onto the end of the axle on both ends. And this will allow me to put the bearings on either end, which the axle will then rotate on when it's, well, rotating. But in addition to that one, I've also milled this little shiny part here down, and that's so that I can take this sprocket, which has an 8mm bore in the centre, and fit right over that, which will then sit just above the location of the bearing. Now, you might wonder why I milled an 8mm bar down to 8mm. Well, that's actually because it isn't really 8mm. Nothing is exact. It's 8.194 something millimeters, but the bore in here is exactly 8mm. So now I know that I've got exactly enough clearance for the sprocket to turn when the chain is attached that will turn the helix. So the next thing to do is drill the helix for the spokes. I'm excited about this bit because the jig to do this I designed and 3D printed. Let's look at that now. So here it is, my little axle drilling jig. Now, honestly, I'm really proud of the construction that went into this and the amount of thought process. So as I said earlier on, I need to drill holes down the shaft, starting with the first hole at 15mm from the top. And then what I need to do is I need to rotate the shaft 120 degrees at a time in between holes, while also drilling holes precisely 33.3mm apart. And this shaft, if it works, will do exactly that for me. The first thing to note about this is that right here in the middle, I've got a little hole. You can probably see that right there. That hole is going to be the location of the drill. So once I've got this in place, I mark it up. I'm going to clamp this down onto the drilling pad so I know exactly where the drill is going to plunge each and every time. What I'll then do is I'll take my axle and I will actually thread the axle into the end of the jig like this. And once it comes up against this stop, that means that the first hole over here somewhere is exactly 15mm from the top, and that stop is used exactly once. Once that's done, I can take out the stop, and then every other single hole that's going to go into that will be done using this little brass pin that I've put over here. Now the brass pin comes back up just here into the channel of the axle at exactly 120 degrees and exactly 33.3mm from the hole. So once the first hole is drilled, all I need to do is move it along until it comes level with the pin, rotate it, pop the pin in, and then because this is all going to be bolted and clamped down, I can then drill the next hole, knowing that I've rotated anti-clockwise exactly 120 degrees, moved by exactly 33.3mm, and then repeat that all the way down the shaft. And I'm doing it with 2.2mm precision drill bits so that I can be sure that every single hole is the exact right size for my 2mm wire to go into and solder in place. Let's see how successful this is going to be. Gosh, it worked, and who would have thought it would? I've now got my my little holes drilled into the axle, going down 33.3mm spaced in an anti-clockwise rotation 120 degrees apart, all from a little homemade 3D printed jig. Now, somebody just mentioned to me that there is in fact a tool in the workshop that calculates rotation and makes it very specific. So are all of these holes perfectly aligned? Well, no, but the truth is they don't necessarily so precisely exactly need to be. They're pretty much near as damn it. And you know what? It's going to look fantastic. Let's put this helix together. I always knew that building this helix was going to be probably one of the most tasking things that I would do, mostly because of how precise it needs to be and how difficult it is to build it in the way that I've imagined. Now, I've seen people do it where they've had the axle and all of the pins have just been in down one side, supporting one side of the axle. I've also seen it where they were every other side, and of course I decided to do the hard thing where I had one every 1 1/3 turn. So there's 3 sets of pins going down the outside of the axle, which of course meant that the axle needed to be drilled properly, it all needed to be spaced properly, and then of course it all needed to be soldered on properly. And the big difficulty there was actually soldering the axle in the exact center of the helix, so that when it turns perfectly on the spot and doesn't wobble around all over the place. So as I mentioned, I'm going to make this box, which of course I have made. And here's the helix on the inside. I've got the holes at the end with the axle in, and because I knew how difficult this was going to be, I've actually already made a start on it, and the fact that there was people working in every one of the shops this evening, so I couldn't really make too many videos, otherwise they'd think I was talking to myself and being a bit of a weirdo, which we all know I'm not. Anyway, have a look at this. I've now started soldering in. Now you can see here the pins that I've started to put in here so that I can do it, and I'm reasonably happy about the fact that this it doesn't turn much at the moment because it's quite tight, but this holds everything else exactly central. I've made sure that everything is exactly as it should be. The axle sits central, the helix turns quite freely when I need it to, so I'm pretty happy with this. I've got 2 more rows of these pins to put in, so I'm going to go and do that now, and then I actually made a cross section for the bottom because I put a whole ring around the base of it. So I'm going to go and get that finished, and the next time I'm on video you should see me holding this completed Helix spiral lift, no box, and it all being able to turn and be, well, really rather beautiful. Quite excited about this. This is a real milestone and also a huge challenge, so I'm so chuffed I was able to get this far. So after yesterday's efforts, I very successfully constructed my Helix. Now I am really happy with this. This is going to be the main lifting mechanism which will fit inside the frame to lift the ball from the bottom to the top so that it can then take its, well, tour of gravity, I suppose. This isn't exactly perfect. I'm not an engineer. I'm making all of this up as I go along and using as many hints and tips from the internet that I can find. So there is a very slight variance in how level all of these edges are all the way around. But you know what? I think that's going to be okay because I've had a quick test on a flat surface and it works. So is that the end of the video? Well, of course not, because just making the Helix doesn't actually solve the problem that this video addresses. This isn't just about the Helix, it's about getting it installed. So this Helix is going to sit roughly here in the machine so that the balls will roll up this side of the Helix screw, and then as they come off the top they will then start their tour of gravity back to the bottom. So how are they going to go up? Well, first off, I'm going to make a little side rail which is going to sit somewhere here-ish, that the balls will get pushed up as they go from the bottom to the top. In addition to that, I also need to put a bearing mount in the bottom and a bearing mount at the top so that the Helix will sit where it needs to be, unhelped by me, because I can't stand here holding this and twisting it. And of course I need to make an on-ramp and an off-ramp. So for the rest of this video and for the rest of this day, I'm going to make the bearing mounts, I'm going to add in the side rails, I'm going to attach the whole thing, and I'm going to make an on-ramp and an off-ramp so that the balls can go into the Helix, travel to the top and leave the Helix, and then the Helix is complete. I needed, of course, to design the bearing housing, and the best way to do that is using the tool I've used to design everything, which has been Fusion 360. This has been a really great resource to have because it allows me to visualise on the screen exactly how the bearings are going to sit and what size they're going to be before I eventually cut them out. I also then use the Wazer software to place them onto the Wazer bed, and of course I sent them over to the Wazer to be cut, which again is an absolutely fantastic resource to have, and the Hackspace is a great place to be able to come and do this kind of thing. Here you can see me just setting up the Wazer, and of course in a second you're going to see a great shot of the Wazer doing its thing, so enjoy that. Okay, so while the Wazer is working its magic and cutting the bearing housings for the Helix, I need to address one or two little minor things with this board. The first of them is that I need to decide where exactly the bearing housing is going to go and where the bottom of the Helix is going to sit. And that's going to be fixed in place. But I also want the top of that brass housing and therefore the bearing to be flush with the board. I don't want them to sit proud. I want to get everything as close to this base as I possibly can so that I can maximize the height that I have. So I need to decide where it's going to go. I need to cut out a hole that's going to sit with the bearing, but also cut out the shoulder which the bearing housing can sit in. While I'm doing that, there's another little thing that I need to address, and that is right here on the base of the board, because while these feet are absolutely beautiful, the second they start to get a little bit loose, this starts to happen, and of course that's not what I want. So I need to get these feet off and properly secured in place so I can put the bolts on. And the way that I'm going to achieve that is that what I've also done is I've cut a little hole in the corner of each of these feet so that when that sits in place I can screw through into the board, and that will hold them and stop them from moving around. So yeah, let's get on with those jobs right now. I could really do with those rounds I've cut for the bearing housing. Oh, that'll do nicely. Oh, hang on. There's another one. Look at that. That's, I tell you what, that Wazer is fantastic. I have to say, I have been so impressed with the Wazer from start to finish. It's just absolutely fantastic. And there we go. 1, 2, 3, 4 bearing housings. Now, I know that on the drawing I had holes and all sorts in these, but I decided I was going to do that on the lathe and the pillar drill, mostly because that's really what it's for. And while using the Wazer is very, very convenient, it is not very cheap. You have to pay for the usage of the materials because of course it cuts with garnet. But I've got my 4 discs. 2 of these will each make a single bearing housing with the shoulder of the bearing sandwiched in between these 2 and not compressed. There's going to be a little cutout so that the bearing just sits in there nice and comfortably. But that, essentially, is where we're at. So let's go and get these bearing housings made. And there we go, that's the 2 marks that I've made in order to house the bearing. Now I'm going to need to take some of this ring out down to a depth of 6mm, which of course is the thickness of 2 plates. But this deeper hole in the middle that I cut with the Forstner bit is essentially to allow the bearing to sit so that it's uninterrupted and there's nothing interfering with it. So the bearing will essentially sit right on the shoulder right there, just in between the 2 plates. That's how that's going to sit. And then this will sit on here. Everything will be nice and flush so that when it all drops in, it's going to look absolutely fantastic. Right, I think I've gone about as far as I can go there. Now it's time to get these bearing housings properly made. So I started by hollowing out the hole I cut in the board to take the bearing housing, which has been the most terrifying part so far because one slip could have destroyed it. Thankfully, I didn't. Once I'd done there, I moved over onto the lathe and I used the centre drill to mark the centres of each of those 4 discs so I knew exactly where the middle was. That was important because after that I moved everything over onto the mill. And I wanted to drill 3 holes around the edge at exactly 15mm from the centre. And that was useful because, as you can see in the bottom right hand corner, there's a DRO. And that DRO allows me to calculate exactly where I need to be down to the 1,000th of a millimetre so that I can drill those 3 holes at exactly 120 degrees around that centre point. It's a great tool to have, and again, something I'm really grateful for in the hack space. After that, it was back over to the lathe, and then centre drilled, pilot drilled, used a larger drill and finally a bore to make sure that the holes in the centre of each of those bearing housing discs was exactly the right width, and of course I cut the shoulders at the same time. I am really, really happy with the progress that I've made today on the Helix Lift and all the bits that are with it. And I think also before I started doing the Helix, before I started this whole thing, I don't think I appreciated just how many fine details are going to be involved in pretty much every decision I'm making at this stage, because this is the engineering part of the whole project. This is the bit that I have to get right. I have to make it work, otherwise everything else is pointless. And a lot of today has been all about these are the bearings that the Helix will rotate in, and of course how I was going to house these bearings. Now if you look at them ever so carefully, you'll notice there, right there, there's a little shoulder on that bearing, and so it can sit, and that will take all the pressure, allowing the bearing to rotate. So I needed to make some little bearing housings, and I made that out of the 3mm plates that I cut earlier on. Now I cut these with two internal diameters, one to allow the bearing to go through, but with a shoulder on one side to catch the bearing, and the other one just to allow the axle plate to go through. So these fit together, and those holes of course line up so that I can bolt through them, but crucially it allows the bearing to sit in place here, which now means that when I put the bearing in, and it just slots in, and as you can see it sits flush, beautifully flush there. It pops out that side, but that's okay for the time being. This piece now goes right on top, so that I can get that now into position, and that now gives me a hole for the axle to go through where it can sit and seat in the bearing on the shoulder I made for it. Now this one I actually made for the top, so I also chamfered the top and bottom edges of this one. This one's going to be exposed, and it's going to sit something like this at the top of the machine. The base one I've already done and put in. I also did some of that there earlier on. But this now means that if I put this together and I just sort of hold this in place like this, that the Helix now spins rather beautifully on the axle. Now of course I need to make sure that it's all aligned and it's all straight and it's all level, and of course I now need to find some way of attaching this top bearing mount housing to the frame to hold it in place so that the Helix can spin unencumbered without me having to hold it in place. But for now, for today, this has been a great project. There's been so many learning points on this, and I'm actually really happy with what I've come up with. So yeah, tomorrow I'm going to get all this attached, put the on-ramp and the off-ramp and the vertical track in place, and hopefully by the end of tomorrow I'll be able to lift marbles. Very exciting. Back in the workshop today after a great refreshing night's sleep, and I'm really keen to get this job finished today. I've done one or two minor things just to get me going. I've attached the bottom bearing properly now to the board with some screws, so that all looks good. I've also properly put together the top bearing, so that's now all bolted together and ready to go. And I've also made a minor amendment to the top of the Helix screw there. As you can see, this very last one pops out. That will just help nudge the balls off the top of the Helix and onto the downward rail as they suddenly experience gravity. Today's job is going to be reasonably straightforward, but they're all really important things. The first thing I need to do is make sure that this top bearing is attached to the top of the frame so that it's permanently in place to keep this axle perfectly vertical. Also, I need to attach the side rail so that the balls have got something to roll up as the Helix turns, and add an on-ramp and an off-ramp. And then I'll be ready to declare this part of the build of the Perpetual Curiosity Engine finished. So let's go. Okay, the first job that I need to do is make sure that this top bearing housing is permanently attached to the top of the frame, and it's going to go roughly here in terms of where it is. I'm going to use a plumb line to make sure that I get it all together, but the first thing I need to do is manufacture some kind of assembly which is going to attach from here onto there and get everything clamped and bolted together. Now that in itself is going to be difficult enough. But of course, what I don't want to do is keep shelling out money on materials when I've already got loads and loads of scraps left. And one of the things that I rather fastidiously did when I cut all of my gussets out was I kept the scrap brass that was left over, because, well, there's plenty of usable material there and I might need washers and all sorts making out of it. And actually that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take probably this piece here and I'm going to use that big central section and turn it into some kind of assembly which will allow me to bolt these two things together and keep everything in place. So let's try and figure that out now. Right, I've managed to get this whole assembly now completely put together. So as I mentioned before, I got the 3 bolts in right there. I've also added this additional tapped thread. This taps through all 3 and actually terminates right down here, just so that it sort of sandwiches everything together from the structural perspective as well. And actually, having done that, I feel like I've caused myself a bit of a problem, because I'm looking at these 3 bolts here with the 3 acorn nuts on top, and I mean, they look rather handsome as they are. But then, of course, I'm also looking at this bolt here, where I've just got the head on one side, and it terminates sort of flush with the bottom on the other. And I am really contemplating actually just drilling in 2 more holes in this space, so I've still got the triangular hole arrangement, tapping those so I can bolt them together and turning these ones into maybe more decorative holes like the rest of the frame. I'm not going to do that right now. I want to get this thing finished and I want to make sure I can put it on and that it is all in the right place. But if I'm going to do it, I will definitely need to do it before I permanently attach it to the frame. So let's see how that all works out. So it's taken quite a bit of time to get this in exactly the right place, but I can now confirm that the Helix is correctly positioned. How have I done that? So I put the plate in at the bottom, and that is recessed into the board, and it's also screwed in place, so that won't work. The bottom bearing is fixed. What I've then done is I've created this extension arm up here, which I'll give you a close-up of just there. There you go. I made that. I'm pretty happy with that. I completely made that from start to finish. It needs a little bit of tidying up yet. I'm going to have to file the back end off, drill through the 2 holes right there, and tap them. All of that is yet to be done at this stage. What you can see is actually the finished, attached and soldered piece right here. It's attached just with a pair of mole grips. But once I put that in place, I then use this. It's a plumb line, really. It's just a piece of string, as you can see, hanging around. I put some washers on the bottom. I attached it to a little rod and I sort of fixed it here. So I was able to look at this through 2 sets of 45 degrees, and I moved it from here to here a couple of times until I got this in exactly the right place. And then when I'm moving it back and forth, it sits exactly vertical adjacent to the string in each occasion. So this is now here. So all I now need to do is solder this right here on top so it's properly affixed. I'm then going to drill through those 2 holes I've already put in there. I'm going to bolt that in place once I've tapped them as well. And then after that, I need to attach the rails and the on-ramp and the off-ramp. And that will be a great day's work. Let's get this finished. I have my helical lift installed. I have an on-ramp where the balls will come after their journey down the machine, and I have an off-ramp where they will go immediately after coming off the helical lift. The idea of this, as I've said before, is simple. The balls arrive at the bottom, the lift lifts them all the way to the top, where it starts them on the journey all over again. I'm not going to lie, this has been really challenging. I had to build the Helix, which in and of itself was very tricky. There was lots of adjustments that I had to do there, despite the fact that I was trying to use a jig to make sure that it was central. Then I had to make sure the Helix was mounted, and I had to get the bearings in place, the bearings in the bottom, and make sure that they were all there. Once that was done, I had to put in this vertical rail, and that alone was a challenge. That took me about a day and a half to get in and get right, because it just didn't want to sit right. Again, lots and lots of adjustments. After that, I did the off-ramp and the on-ramp. They've taken me about a day in total to get those two things in place. But at this point, I'm happy to say that the Helix lift is finished. And as you can see, it's queued up with balls and it's ready to go. The balls will come in at the bottom, they'll go up to the top of the lift, and they will come out again at the top. And, all being well, it should look like this. That is just so satisfying. Well, I'm still amazed that I built this. Absolutely brilliant. Next step is to make it automatic, so all I need to do is flick a switch. The Helix will start to turn all on its own. The balls will go in at the bottom, they'll come out at the top. We're nearly getting to some of the really exciting stuff. Next time round, I'm going to look to add in the electronics to make sure that I have power on this and that the Helix turns. I'm also going to add a clutch. I'll probably make that as two separate videos, one perhaps right after the other. And yeah, after that, it's going to be time to start getting the ball rolling.